There's nothing more important for the future of agriculture than the ability to make money in this industry at the farm level. And right now, the farm economy is not in great shape.
Elasticities in agriculture tells us that whenever we move from just right to too little or too much, that's what gives us these really, really big changes. And, the markets are worried about the current situation and they don't see a clear answer. That's when we see dramatic responses, because the cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low prices is low prices.
That's ag economist David Widmar, who joins me again a year after his last appearance on the show to discuss the state of the ag economy in 2025 and some things to consider in navigating the current down cycle.
We all want to say, I survived the last cycle. I'll just do what I did last time. And some of those tools might not be available. And the key difference here is that rising interest rate environment.
Today, David shares 3 big risks to the ag economy in 2025 and some ways to manage them.
Farmers can put grain in the bin on the same day and they can take it out on the same day. Some of them are going to have investment grade decisions and some of them are going to have gambling grade decisions. And the idea, I think, that's important is if you continue to do that investment grade decisions year in and year out, that's going to create huge, huge value for you.
David Widmar of Agricultural Economic Insights on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hammerich, and every week you and I get to hear from the farmers, founders, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. Well, I am excited to dive into today's episode, but right before we do, I want to take just a moment to recognize our quarterly presenting sponsor, which this quarter is Case IH. As most of you know, I'm fascinated by the way technology and innovation are shaping the future of agriculture, hence that's why I do this podcast, and it's also why I'm really excited to partner with Case IH this quarter. Case IH designs, engineers, and produces cutting-edge farm equipment based on a comprehensive understanding of farmers' needs, wants, and challenges, integrating these insights into their development and manufacturing. For example, take their model year 25 Magnum tractor. The new Magnum is purposefully designed to answer farmers' needs in every design and engineering choice. Improved horsepower for pulling heavier loads faster, bundled, integrated, and ready-to-go precision tech for greater accuracy in the field, and a transmission farmers can tweak for improved control and performance in different tasks. That kind of design thinking is exactly where the future of ag is headed, and that's why you'll be hearing me talk to a few folks at Case IH at different points throughout this quarter about what they do and how they're working to push ag forward. Thanks again to Case IH for their leadership in ag innovation and for supporting the Future of Agriculture podcast. All right, now back to today's episode with David Widmar. David first appeared on the show a year ago on episode 399, which actually ended up being one of our most listened to episodes of the year. Today, he's back to discuss the current state of the ag economy, something that's on a lot of the minds of people in the industry, the margin squeeze that farmers are facing, and where that places us on the economic cycle that these commodities tend to follow. We also talk about some key ideas and what I'll call mental models that David has written about for how we should look at or manage this risk during this challenging time for the industry. As background here, David Widmar is an agricultural economist specializing in ag trends and the farm economy. Through his research, he supports agribusinesses and farmers in their strategic and planning efforts. David's current work can be found at the Agricultural Economic Insights website, which is aei.ag, which he co-founded with Dr. Brent Gloy in 2014. Prior to Agricultural Economic Insights, David was a researcher with the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University and served as the economist for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I'm going to drop into the conversation here where David is sort of setting the scene for us about the current state of the ag economy.
Well, we call it the roller coaster chart, and I can share that image if that's of value. And many folks recognize it as a tractor looking like it's on a roller coaster. And this chart is really helpful because it works through the cycle of production in agriculture. And there's 5 or 6 different phases in this production cycle. But what generally happens is we have a stable era, boom eras, and we call the margin squeeze, which feels like a bust. Then there's the recovery, and then we go back to a stable era. And that chart's based on what we see in net farm income that the USDA reports, and producers will feel this and observe this throughout their careers. There are years, and they're usually back to back, and they could last for decades, where you don't change things much from year to year. In fact, I always kind of make the joke that you're in a stable era in agriculture when you can take last year's budget, livestock budget, crop budget, cash flow budget, change the data at the top and get it past your lender. Now, we're not in one of those environments today by any stretch of the imagination. You can't even use last month's estimates. So those stable eras, those are where we spend a lot of time, and those are difficult for their own sets of reasons. But there's historically been some stable eras, and arguably we had one of those in the 90s and early 2000s, and maybe briefly between 2015 and 2017 and 18. But that last period had a lot of uncertainty in that as well. But what really gets things going in the farm economy is not usually weather by itself, it's demand shocks. And these demand shocks can be like we had recently when after COVID, we had China buying a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans going into fuel, the fuel supply. Before then, we had China buying soybeans and corn going to ethanol. And then, of course, in the 70s, we had a really strong run of farm income when the USSR stole the winter wheat crop, and that kicked off all sorts of inflationary challenges throughout that decade. And then we also see after World War I and after World War II, there's a lot of demand for ag products as Europe's rebuilding and recovering from those terrible challenges that they faced on the continent. And so when you look at the history of agriculture, there just aren't that many boom years. And we look at this as a standard deviation that gets way up there. So if we're at about $100 billion in net farm income on average, farm incomes that are above 130 or 140 or 150, we were at 200 billion a couple of years ago. That's the highest single point observation we've had in the past 95 years. So this is sort of the context, is we had a really big run up in commodity ag prices after 2020. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had China buying a lot of corn. We had a lot of soybeans. We were looking at domestic crush for soybeans going up a lot, and stocks got tight. And we saw profits go up. You had really low interest rates. If you really want to have a boom in farmland values, you need to have really strong income and really low interest rates. And we had those in spades. And so we got all that excitement and all that enthusiasm, and it kind of peaked in 2022. And now we're sort of unraveling that, unwrapping that. Eventually, the world does figure out a way to oversupply agricultural products. We bring more farmland on production. We bring more animals into the production system. And so we've sort of moved past that, at least for the time being. And we're now dealing with a situation where commodity prices have fallen faster than the cost of production. And so producers are facing this margin squeeze. And that's where we're at, is sort of how do producers navigate the next few years of tightening their costs, trying to find where that commodity prices might, stabilize at? Where can we count as a new norm, a new normal price? And then how do we start to put together plans and budgets and sort of long-term plans that we can start to grow our business from that? Because at this point, during this margin squeeze, it's just sort of, how do we get through this year? How do we get through next year? And how do we find where that new equilibrium might be? So that's a long answer to a short question. No. Apologize for that.
No, it's great. I wanted the background. No, I appreciate that. And, for this unraveling to stabilize, this margin squeeze to stabilize, does it take another demand shock, or will it sort of, slowly unwind until it starts to stabilize for the most efficient producers and kind of go from there?
Well, that's a really great question. And one of the big unknowns is how low commodity prices are going to have to go. So we look really carefully at costs of production. And as economists, we believe that in the long run, economic production costs will roughly equal the commodity price. And so that's where we're looking at. And economic costs are, a cost that economists care a lot about, but most people in the real world don't think about that. But economic costs really means we have charged every asset and every piece of labor and every acre and every land. We've given a charge to that into the budget. So it's a full cost. And so, even if you own your land or you rent your land, we're putting in a cost for that. And so we can watch commodity prices and we can watch costs of production, and we're looking for those two things to sort of stabilize. Generally, what happens is these demand shocks tell the world we do not have enough acreage, or we do not have enough animals. And so it takes really big profits, really big economic profits. Like I talked about earlier, going from 100 billion to 200 billion. That's a doubling of profits. Now, those profits aren't exactly walking around money. Farmers have to pay family living out of that. They have to service their debt with it. But that doubling is an economic signal that producers in the U.S. and around the world get. And so they try to figure out ways to expand production. And in the U.S., we mostly lean in through efficiencies or maybe some double cropping. We try to bump yields just a little bit. It's hard in the U.S., but around the world, they bring on more acres. And eventually, we get enough supply brought online, and there's an oversupply. So going back to your question, it really depends on how much oversupply, how much overcapacity there is in the system. It took us a long time in the 1980s. In fact, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, was sort of a domestic attempt to rein in production. And we had a lot of ending stocks in the 1980s, and that really fueled and added that crisis during that era. But in general, we got to watch it. How is global expansion unfolding? How are our global stocks stabilizing? And, where do the costs of production really need to go? Luckily, producers, especially in the Corn Belt, corn, soybeans, wheat, have benefited from lower fertilizer prices. And so that might have helped out a lot. But if we see prices continue to work their way lower, it's going to be more painful as producers have got to work on fixed costs, those costs that are more, near and dear and more specific and unique to their operation.
And this is maybe not the smartest question, but I think it'll take you in a good direction, which is, have things really changed so drastically that, in the global supply and demand, have we brought on that many new acres, or has demand, decreased by that much to go from such high net farm income to where we are today?
Right. One of the things that we keep an eye on is world harvested acres. And those do not increase linearly over time. Well, let's back up for a second. The first thing that chart busts, the first myth it busts, is that farmland's a good investment because they're not making any more of it. That might be true from a biological standpoint, from a rocks, grinding away standpoint. But economists believe that we can find new ways to bring production ag online. So that's the first thing that graph tells us. The second thing it tells us is it's not linear. We see, periods where we bring a lot of acreage on, like in the 70s and like the mid 2000s to 2015. And then the last couple of years, we bring on a lot of acres around the world. And then there are big pauses. And so South America and Ukraine, interestingly, parts of the former Soviet Union, and then even India has been bringing more acreage online. And that's starting to slow down a little bit, especially Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost acres, but those adding. And so, yes, those additions do add up. But what makes the income story in the commodity price situation so dramatic is what we call the elasticity. And so it's the fact that a very small change in quantities has a really big change in commodity prices. And so producers know this intuitively. You can kind of stick around. Let's go back to corn for an example. Corn ending stocks, if they're hanging out around 10 to 15%, commodity prices are going up and down, but they're not dramatically moving. But all of a sudden the world wakes up and says, we don't have enough corn. Prices go up a lot. And all of a sudden we have too much corn and prices go down a little. It's kind of like Goldilocks, right? The porridge is either too hot, too cold, or just right. And elasticities in agriculture tells us that whenever we move from just right to too little or too much, that's what gives us these really, really big changes. And, if you think back to even the 1980s farm crisis, that was a situation where we had too much and it was obvious we were going to have too much for multiple years. So, the markets are worried about the current situation and they don't see a clear answer. That's when we see dramatic responses because A, we got to either bring more acreage online, or B, we got to encourage economically end users to find alternatives or be more efficient or just use less of it. The cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low prices is low prices. And that is very true in ag. And it's because of that inelasticity of the production system.
If you're talking to a farmer, which I know, you do regularly, at least through your newsletter, and then I'm sure through other conversations as well, and they say, well, like, just holding on kind of sucks, right? Like just hoping it gets better kind of sucks. Like what, help me keep perspective here. Why, I should stay optimistic that this cycle, it's not different this time. This cycle is going to come back around like it has in the past.
Well, I think the first step is where are we headed, right? And we're not headed back to a boom. In fact, if you look at the farm income history, there was, the 40s and 50s, and then we went to a stable era. Then we had a spike in the 70s, and then we went to a stable era. Then it wasn't until the mid 2000s. So these booms tend to be pretty far apart. There's nothing saying there couldn't be one right around the corner, but the idea is they're somewhat rare, they're somewhat infrequent. It depends on how much yields increase, how much demand increases, how much acreage changes. So there's a rhythm to that. But we're going back to a stable era, and the stable era is this idea of, very little, if any, economic profits in the long run. And this idea that you're able to make, decades worth of income in a very short period of time, that is probably where we're going to be going. So producers need to kind of be realistic about where we're headed, and that at zero economic profits, you're getting a return on all those assets and resources utilized. And so you're going to be able to grow your net worth. And if you're able to get your cost of production even lower, you can make some economic profits. I always tell producers at zero economic profits, your accountant's probably going to give you a tax bill, right? Like, this is the way that works out. But the point here is the margin squeeze is what we want to get out of. And that's going to take, that cost cutting. And at this point, it's a little unclear how much of the cost cutting is going to come out of the variable costs, the things that we get price sheets for, and how much of it's going to come out of the things that we do around the farmstead, our family living, our labor, our machinery, our cash rents, and our farmland values.
And is there any data to indicate what tends to get cut first?
So fertilizer, not surprisingly, often runs up quickly and runs down quickly. That's a big change. And we also know that farmland is one of the slowest ones to change. And so I always like to tell producers, when we're going through a boom, those that can hold their cost structure, especially those fixed costs, low, they're able to capture more profits as we work our way through a higher cost per bushel. And so, profits is really the price per bushel, or the price per head, or the price per pound, less the cost per bushel, or cost per head, or cost per pound. So if you can hold your costs low, and when commodity prices are going up, if you're resisting that upward pressure, you're going to capture even more dollars. On the other hand, those who are able to change their cost structure the most quickly to the downturn, when commodity prices fall faster than our cost structure, they're going to be the ones that thrive. So you have to have a very sticky cost structure during the booms, and then you have to be very flexible during the downturns. And unfortunately, producers all have a different response, and so they have to really be focused on. I think one example is cash rent. So if you're in a sharecropping situation, or you're in a flex lease with a bonus type agreement, or you have a cash rent agreement, those all perform differently during these boom and slowdown cycles. And so I think that's a really key feature to keep in mind, is sometimes it's just as simple as the types of contracts that we enter into, and they all perform just a little different.
Just getting creative with how those leases are structured.
And thinking about the long-term implications of, if things change, how does that play out? Economics is really the study of trade-offs. And so, the great thing about a fixed cash rent that's 3 or 4 years is I know my cost, and I can plan it out for quite a while. But if the farm economy dramatically changes, the person on the other side of the lease might not like that if corn shoots up really high, and you might not like it if corn prices fall a lot. And so that's that trade-off, and we all start with, that example, and we create all sorts of deviations from that. But again, it's just thinking about, how can I, make sure that I know my cost structure and I can really understand that and how it plays out. Fixed costs are the least fun to measure, the least fun to benchmark. And one of the reasons is because it's very unique to my operation. I can't call up a co-op or a retailer or a manufacturer and say, give me your price sheet for family living and for 1,000 acres of these farmland acres. And they're really hard to benchmark, but they're ours. And so once we get a good process around measuring those and planning those, we can actually plot those out for several years. I always like to tell young producers, if you're able to know and manage your fixed costs and have a low fixed cost, it's going to create a whole lot of value for you throughout your entire career.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, you recently came out with your risks for the new year, which I think you do every year, if I remember right. And I thought your 3 were very interesting and poignant. I wanted to see if we could maybe go through them here, starting with trade implosion. And this is a risk that I think is maybe not talked about enough, but maybe that's because we don't know exactly what that'll look like. But talk about why this made the top of the list and kind of your thoughts on that.
Well, so far we've been talking about, demand shocks as a positive. And so And what happens in a demand shock, and I can't draw the supply and demand curves here for you like all of us love to do in our introductory to economics courses, but when you move the demand curve, what really happens is we're able to sell more quantities at a higher price. And that's really exciting. If you think about weather events, we might have more bushels, but we have a lower price. So we might have fewer bushels with a higher price. But the demand shocks to the upside is when we have more of both. And this trade implosion would represent an adverse demand shock. That demand curve moves backwards, meaning now we're going to be selling fewer or exporting fewer bushels, and those bushels we do export are going to have to go out at a lower price. Now, we all had lived through a little bit of this during the trade war in 2018 and 19 and into parts of 2020. And one of the things that happened there is we had a lot of MFP payments to help offset that. So government programs, ad hoc government programs stepped in and offset that income. Grain stocks built up a whole lot. Thankfully, if you're thinking about commodity prices, I guess there's always a trade-off. And, we had a big prevent plant situation in 2019, so that helped pull back those stocks quite a little bit. But the problem here with trade is that a trade implosion would be, and I'm thinking about those commodities we export, is we just keep piling them up. They start getting more and more inventories. We keep moving acres into other crops, which increases the stocks there. So if soybeans go into a trade war, we're going to plant fewer soybean acres. That means more corn, maybe more wheat, maybe more sorghum and hay, and all those other crops start to see their ending stocks grow up. And so there is just not a lot of tools to address that. Yes, government programs help, but that's sort of a Band-Aid. And in the long term, there's not a lot of risk management tools either. And so you think about crop insurance, it's a year-over-year change that it helps with. Working capital can only last us so long. So these trade implosions is just an issue where we don't have a lot of risk management. We don't have a lot of policy programs to help fix that. And that's why we're thinking about that. I think that the long tail on that could be really, really challenging. I think the other thing that we should mention here is we did an article and we looked at net exports. So, exports minus imports. And we looked at the commodities production. There are definitely ag commodities that would have some benefits of the U.S. imposed tariffs. Thinking about maybe some vegetables. If we import a lot of those and there's some domestic production, if we put a tariff on those imports, domestic prices will go up. Those producers will have incentive to plant more of those acres. And interestingly, those are the consumer concerns, right? Those are the commodities that we talk about are going to go up in the grocery store. And then the retaliatory tariffs, those trade implosion concerns that we're talking about, that's where farmers face a lot of risk. There's always a bad story around trade. It's just, are we talking about consumers and are we talking about producers, and which commodities are we talking about? Which trade partners are we talking about?
Sure. Well, let's go to the second risk you mentioned. So the first one was, trade implosion. Number two is asset prices. And when you say asset prices, do you mean farmland? Do you mean equipment? All the above? What are we talking about there?
We took a focus and an emphasis on farmland, but I think there are more applicable. It's more broadly than just farmland. And I think farmland's appealing because, for us as economists, there's a lot of data out there on it, but the idea of it's easier to think through. And so the way we think about this is if you have, you're going to go think about buying a farm, and you can think about this as, how much rent could I generate or how much profit could I generate off that farm? And then you can also think about what kind of rate of return might I be expecting from this type of investment? And then, what's the farm's value? So those three variables together will tell you a lot about the asset's value. And so if you look at, say, cash rental rates and farmland values in the Midwest, you're going to see a relationship there. We call it the capitalization rate. It's in the low twos, like it's 2.3% in Indiana farmland values. And it's pretty consistent across the Corn Belt. It's around 2. And why it's important is because you could get a higher rate of return, not pay property taxes at the local bank with a CD. And so this is where we are in the situation where a lot of asset values are still priced at a lower cap rate. Now, the market's at a higher cap rate. It takes time to work these things through the market. When the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates, it takes a lot of time to move through the whole system. A combination of adjustments to valuations, adjustments to the expectations of returns, adjustments to cash rental rates, all these things will adjust to find a new equilibrium. But I think one of the challenges here is that you can look back and say, well, where is inflation and where are interest rates going in the economy? And I'm not so sure there's as much downside potential in interest rates, especially farm level interest rates, as we move forward. And you could see a situation where we've had a really strong economy, and if there's a lot of enthusiasm, you could see, asset values going even higher. You don't have to look very far to see asset values in the stock market, for example, going up a whole lot, or in crypto markets going up a whole lot. And so the idea here is I think that asset values are in this troublesome spot where it's probably not going to see small changes. It's probably going to be big changes. We can all have our opinion if it's to the upside or the downside, and we can have our theses behind that. But I feel like asset values just have a lot of potential movement here ahead of them, given just some of the headwinds of declining incomes, changes in the interest rate environment, future interest rate expectations shifting as well.
Is part of that the fact that you think there'll be big changes ahead? Is that based on those drivers? Can you connect that? I don't know that I'm fully understand. I understand the case for it being overvalued right now at the low cap rates. I understand the case for it kind of going higher based on what you just said. But what makes you think it'll be a big jump either way?
Well, I think I'll be the two-sided economist here for a minute. If you think that we're going to have longer and higher interest rates throughout the economy, so higher for longer interest rates, that could really put some downward pressure on asset values. If, on the other hand, you think that, price inflation is what we measure, but we also have asset inflation, and we don't really measure that too much in the economy, but they're cousins. And so if you were starting to be very optimistic about the future of the U.S. economy and what's going to be going on in the months ahead, and, the Fed is slow to adjust on inflation data like they have been in the past, you could see a situation where asset values were to take off again and commodity prices take off again, and all of a sudden that would jump up a lot. And so it's sort of this idea here that the Fed is sort of looking for, going back to Goldilocks, right? The Fed's trying to look for this just right combination. And if the assumptions get outside of those bounds, I think that the movements could be quite big. So if they keep holding rates higher, then it's downward pressure. If we see a flare up inflation, it could be higher asset values. So that's the challenge. Is I think that there's just everyone wants to think about this as like, oh, we're just going to change this a little bit here and a little bit there. It's a little bit more difficult than that. There's a lot of moving pieces, and getting these all to line up right, and it works its way throughout the economy and eventually the farm economy. It's a challenge.
That makes sense. Yeah, appreciate that. All right, so the third assumption, are we going to have some sort of ad hoc farm program, not assumption, excuse me, the third risk, are we going to have some sort of ad hoc farm program? Can you talk about that?
Well, first off, keep in mind, we were writing this in December before President Biden signed this. So this is already one element of a $30+ billion ad hoc program. If you look through history, this is the second biggest ad hoc program. If you make some back of the envelope calculations, we're probably going to have the second biggest direct farm payment in history, adjusting for inflation, going into the farm economy, probably north of $40 billion. So big government programs, and there's two sides to this coin. The one side is that it's going to help offset some of those working capital crunches, some of those cash flow concerns. The other side is it giving us an excuse to put off doing the hard work? Is it giving us an excuse to not, cut those expenses, maybe, negotiate those cash rents lower? And that's a hard conversation, right? It's a hard conversation. But what makes ad hoc so challenging is that we're at the whim of Congress. And so Congress for the last 5 or 6 years has been constantly bypassing the Farm Bill, giving us new programs. At some point, the music's going to stop, and the question is, how many chairs are there going to be? Is there going to be enough chairs for everyone looking for a seat? And even what's interesting is we're talking about a program that's going to get paid in the next 3 or 4 months, in the early months of 2025, for 2024 production losses. The 2025 crop budgets don't look that great either. You could make the argument that we're going to be in a similar economic loss situation. So we're going to do another round of those payments here for 2025 production. And it all started, back with the MFP from the trade war. We talked about that a few points ago. And so there's just kind of been one challenge after the next. And historically, it's not that farm payments are unusual. It's the type of payments, these ad hoc, that are unusual. They're almost impossible for producers to budget and plan for. And so how are they going to use those? How are they going to deploy those? It's a big question mark, and it's a big question mark as to when or if the next one will come.
Yeah, no, I could see where that creates challenges. And that actually might be a decent segue into another article of yours I wanted to talk about, which is this whole concept of farming being a gamble. Is it just a gamble? And maybe we'll see profits, maybe we'll see ad hoc payments. You hear that a lot. Farming's a gamble, and you were sort of pushing back against that narrative and saying, well, like, look, you can approach it as a gamble, but you can also approach it from the lens of, either an investor or a speculator. Can you talk about how you can have three different lenses for the same game, or maybe everybody's kind of playing their own game, but the rules are the same? How would you frame that up?
Yeah, I think we've all heard that expression that, farming's a gamble. It's like going into a casino, or the odds are better in Vegas. There's some variation of that. And I think that, what part of that statement resonates and has some truth? Because it's a feeling that a lot of us have felt at different times. And I think the idea is that the stakes are high. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of risk. And there's an element of something being out of our control, right? It's how the dice fall, or it's how the raindrops fall. And that lends itself to that idea, like it feels like a bit of a gamble. But when we set up that article, we introduced the character or the individual known as Mattress Mac. And Mattress Mac has a really interesting betting history. And so you can Google search him. I'm not going to be able to, but he has some of the records for the biggest wins and some of the biggest loss for online gambling. And if I were to do that, I would have a gambling problem, right? That's a gamble. But in the story of Mattress Mac, he's using the same platform that all of us could be using, but he's turning that into a sales tool for his furniture store, Mattress Mac. And so the idea here is he tells everybody, here's a really big game that's important for the Houston area where his stores are. And if this is the outcome, we'll give you all this furniture for free within this time frame. There's a lot of rules around this, but he uses that bet as a hedge, like farmers might be using the futures market as a hedge. And so it challenged us to think about, well, what's the difference between a gamble and a speculation and a bet? Well, it's not the action, right? It's not the act of going on to your favorite betting app or your favorite commodity futures exchange and taking a position. It's the mindset that you're using for that. And so how can we go from making gambles, which is kind of, hey, there's this thing happening and I got to respond to it. I got to make a decision. So I'm either going to pick black or red, right? And so how do we turn that decision that we're facing? How do we increase? How do we upgrade, the insights that we're bringing into it, and how do we make sure it's more valuable? So part of it's, connecting your crop insurance plans and your marketing plans and your cash flow projections. How can we tie all that together so it's not a gamble that I made the right crop insurance decision, or that I picked the right government program between ARC and PLC, or that I, have enough cash flow to get me through harvest? How do we pull all that together so that our decisions, are leading us to the outcomes that we want to have? And I think, it's even going back to like marketing grain, right? Are you putting grain in the bin? Farmers go through harvest and they put some grain in the bin. A bunch of farmers in a county, and they all do that same decision. Some of them are undoubtedly doing that as a gamble. They're just betting on the price at some point in the future to be higher. And others are looking at the markets and they're saying, I can see this basis opportunity. I can see this futures market opportunity. I want to lock those in. And so that is now turning into an investment grade decision. It's not necessarily a gamble. So the idea, to wrap that up, is farmers can put grain in the same bin at the same time, or they put grain in the bin on the same day and they could take it out on the same day. So they're going to have the same outcome. Some of them are going to have investment grade decisions and some of them are going to have gambling grade decisions. And the idea, I think, that's important is if you continue to do that investment grade decisions year in and year out, that's going to create huge, huge values for you. Your neighbor could get lucky, but it could also go poorly. As Mattress Mac continues to make investment grade bets for his store as a sales mechanism, that could be a really big long-term advantage for him. If he stops linking that bet to the sales in the store, that linking those two decisions and outcomes, he could find himself in a world of financial hurt in a very short period of time.
I love the Mattress Mac example. My wife lived in Houston for part of her childhood, and she remembers all the Mattress Mac commercials growing up. So that's great. I know, and I don't know which article it was in. In one of the articles, you kind of talked about how in the last kind of downturn in the farm economy, farmers were able to sort of restructure their balance sheets and kind of tap into some cash, and maybe they're not able to do that now. Can you talk about that a little bit for us? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Well, one of the questions is, what's the effect of higher interest rates? And we all think about it as like, oh, it's going to cost me more to buy my house in terms of interest. So it's going to cost me more to buy a vehicle in terms of interest expense. And there's a lot of ways that high interest rates affect the economy. We talked about asset values earlier. There's the investment hurdle. But the other piece here is when we were in the farm economy downturn back in 2014, 15, 16, anecdotally at least, producers were able to, because we had strong farmland value appreciation, and they were able to work with their lenders to refinance that farmland. So the idea here is, as a simplification, we bought land 7 years ago, it has some equity, can we refinance that, and what kind of payment can we get ourselves to? And so historically, maybe that payment would fall by, it'd go from, it's 100% today, and we refinance it, we bring it down to, 75 or 70% of what it had been. That's going to free up some of our cash flow obligations. It's going to allow us to maybe take a little bit of a breather on our working capital burn. So that was the tool. And we were able to step back and measure a little bit, what does this look like? And today, because we now have another farm economy slowdown, another margin squeeze, if we want to use that strategy, the high interest rate environment takes a lot of that appeal away. So the trade-off, of course, is when you refinance, you add more years to the final note payoff. You have more years of interest being accrued. But in this environment, we have a higher interest rate. And so it's only going to save us, $10 or $20 an acre, and the payments go from 100% down to 90%. And so I think what's important to recognize is that we all want to say, oh, I survived the last cycle, I'll just do what I did last time. And some of those tools might not be available. And the key difference here is that rising interest rate environment. And I think that's what's going to just change things up a little bit. And the challenge here is the farm economy is very small relative to the global economy, or the US economy, I should say. And so what happens is the farm economy doesn't always make its way to the FOMC meetings, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee. So the challenges in the farm economy are very real for those in the farm economy, but that necessarily doesn't mean there's going to be an easing of, the interest rate that we might have to pay. So that's how that plays out, and that's how that's important.
I appreciate that. I might be remembering wrong, but for some reason I want to say when you were on a year ago, we talked about kind of the farm debt situation and how, as far as like debt on the farm was actually in relatively good shape coming off of some really good years before the downturn. Number one, am I remembering that correctly? Number two, is that still the case?
Well, we have a lot of debt out there, and on inflation-adjusted terms, it's the highest debt levels that we've ever seen. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and one of them is sort of the debt-to-asset ratio, and that looks pretty appealing. That's a measure. The problem with the debt-to-asset ratio is that's a lagged, so usually it's asset values falling that really causes the debt-to-asset ratio to get wonky. But on the whole, the debt situation hasn't looked to be very challenging. But again, the question is, how low does commodity prices get? How long are we in this environment? And that starts to become more uncertainty, less clarity around that. But it's important not to just look at total farm debts per se. That's a bit of a misleading fact. One of the key differences between today and 10 years ago, but really today versus the 1970s, is that there is more fixed interest rates out there. So that's helpful. So some of that increase has not been as big of a sticker shock at the farm level. And I think the other thing that's really key is that the type of debt used today. So I told you earlier that in total, it's higher than it's ever been on an inflation-adjusted basis. But we're using a larger share of that is farmland debt. And so again, that's longer terms, that's more likely to be a fixed rate. And so, if you think about, we don't pay farms debt back at the sector level or across all the farms. But if you think about, if you have $1,000 of debt, if you have short-term debt, you're going to be paying that over 2 or 3 years, and it's more likely to have variable interest rates. If you have long-term debt, you might be paying that $1,000 over 10 or 15 years, and it's more likely to have a fixed interest rate. So you can think about what's your annual payment going to look like and how much risk does that payment have to be. So I think that's a really key improvement in terms of the farm economy, a key difference today versus the 80s.
Great. David, I appreciate this. I'm so glad you came back on again, and it's good to get sort of a state of the farm economy and think about some of this stuff beyond just the headlines. So really appreciate this. Obviously, we'll send everybody to AEI to make sure you sign up for the free newsletter and then paid subscription if it fits for you. Anything else though we should mention, either add or emphasize before I let you go?
Just wishing everybody all the best in 2025. I think one of the last things I'll mention here is, given all the uncertainty, it can feel like there's, a lack of decisions to be made or a lack of good decisions to be made. But I think it's the decisions that producers are able to make in the next year or two that will ultimately set themselves up for success in the years to come. And so it's these decisions we make in the difficult times often pay bigger dividends in the long run than some of those good year decisions. And so I think if we're willing to, look introspectively at our situation, and we're willing to, lean into that uncertainty and really challenge our assumptions and how we're approaching that, and we make some of those difficult decisions, it could really pay and set us up for success, as we move forward. These are the times where there could be a lot of opportunities. There's that Warren Buffett quote that's, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. It's hard to do that. It's hard to be that contrarian. But I think the idea here is that if you can just step back just a little bit and your situation, where you're at, and you can move forward through some of this uncertainty and keep making decisions. The worst thing you can do is to freeze up and not make decisions. And I think if we can keep making decisions, small steps, small progress, that'll work out for us well in the long run.
All right, we will go ahead and wrap it up right there. Huge thank you to David Widmar for coming back on the show for a second time to talk about the current state of the ag economy. I think this is a very, very important conversation, and I enjoyed having it early in the year last year, and I think it's really good again this year to set some context for all of the many innovations and interesting ideas we talk about. We really need to have this economic context always in mind. Highly encourage you to go subscribe. They have both a free newsletter and a paid subscription at aei.ag. Of course, that will be linked in the show notes. Also, big thank you to Case IH for being our quarterly presenting sponsor. Go learn more about them at their website, caseih.com. As always, thank you for your time and your attention. I never take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.